The room was dim, filled with the dying amber light of late evening. Dust floated like ghosts in the slits of sunlight cutting through the heavy curtains. Layla stood in the center of the bedroom, motionless, her hands hovering above the open suitcase on the bed. The silence in the house was thick, but not unfamiliar, the kind of silence that came with years of walking on eggshells. Her breath caught as she heard his footsteps. Slow. Calculated. Then came his voice, sharp and hollow like the snap of cold glass. "Leave," Kareem said, standing in the doorway in his crisp white shirt, unbuttoned at the top. "And take nothing. Not even your dignity." Layla didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the suitcase, filled with nothing but an old scarf and a folded photo of her mother. She had packed lightly, he'd told her she would leave with nothing, and so she had obeyed. Outwardly. But her fingers twitched. She turned slightly, eyes landing on the drawer across the room, the one he always kept locked. The one she was never allowed to open. The forbidden drawer. She had asked about it once, years ago. He had smiled then, but it never reached his eyes. "Some things are best left closed," he had whispered, kissing her forehead with lips like ice. Tonight, she wasn't asking. Kareem watched her, brows furrowed. "Don't test me, Layla," he warned. She stepped forward anyway. One slow step at a time. Her hands didn't tremble. She knelt before the drawer like it was an altar, reverent and calm. He didn't stop her. Maybe he didn't believe she'd dare. Maybe he thought she didn't know how to open it. But she did. She had found the key weeks ago, tucked inside the spine of an old philosophy book, the one he never read. She slid the key in. Turned it. The drawer creaked open with a sound that felt too loud. Inside, something waited. She reached in. Her face remained unreadable. She took it, whatever it was, and slipped it quietly into her coat pocket. Then she stood. Kareem's face went pale, though he said nothing. Layla turned once more to the suitcase. Zipped it shut. Walked past him without a word. As she opened the front door, the screen faded to black. 3 months earlier. "I used to believe in fairy tales. Not the ones with glass slippers or magic spells, just the kind where someone sees you drowning in your own life and decides you're worth saving." That's what Kareem felt like when I met him. He was older by 6 years, effortlessly composed, the kind of man who made waiters stand straighter and rooms quiet down when he entered. A storm in a suit, dangerous but beautiful. I was 25 then, fresh out of university, working 2 jobs and living in a rented flat with a broken window that whistled every time the wind passed. My life was cracked, patched together with hopeful tape. Kareem saw me. Or at least, he acted like he did. He'd come into the bookstore I worked at, always asking for titles he never bought. He told me my voice was gentle like rain. That I moved like music. That I deserved better than sorting shelves and wiping coffee rings off countertops. I believed him. We were married within 9 months. His house felt like a castle, white marble floors, tall windows, a library that smelled like leather and smoke. He said I didn't have to work anymore. That I could finally rest. At first, it felt like a gift. I quit my job, stopped painting, left the gallery I had barely started exhibiting in. I told myself I was becoming something new. Something golden. But silence grows quickly inside big houses. At first, it was subtle, he'd raise a brow when I went out without telling him. Then it became questions. Then accusations. "Why are you wearing that? Who are you texting? What did you talk about with her for so long?" The phone calls to friends slowed. Then stopped. He didn't tell me to cut them off. He didn't have to. He made every interaction feel like a betrayal. I stopped answering texts. My mother said I seemed distant. I told her I was happy. Even I wanted to believe it. But Kareem's love had sharp edges, it cut you when you weren't looking. And his mansion became a maze of rules, doors I couldn't open, places I couldn't go. The office was always locked. So was the drawer in the bedroom dresser. I used to ask what was inside, pretending it didn't matter. He'd smile, slow and tight. Things that don't concern you. He made me believe that boundaries were respect. That his secrets were strength. That my questions were proof I didn't trust him. And slowly, I stopped asking. He handled all the finances. I had no access to the accounts. When I needed something, even a toothbrush, I had to ask him. It was never no, not exactly. But the way he'd pause, the weight of his gaze, it made me feel like I owed him for everything. One time, I tried to write again, just sketches in my old notebook, a few lines of poetry. He found them. Didn't yell. Didn't tear the pages. Just sat beside me and said, "Is my love not enough that you still need to invent things to feel seen?" After that, I stopped writing. But I noticed the drawer more after that. It was a tiny thing, elegant, old wood, one brass handle. Locked. Always locked. And when I'd catch Kareem standing near it, his fingers resting on top, he looked different. Not cold. Not cruel. Afraid. He was scared of whatever was in there. It didn't make sense at first. Kareem was fearless. He was power wrapped in human skin. But that drawer, that small, silent thing, made his jaw tighten and his eyes dart. That's when I began to realize, he feared something. Not me. Not consequences. He feared the truth. And truth doesn't stay buried. It waits. Patiently. One day, he walked past me while I was cleaning the hallway. I was on my knees scrubbing the floor. I remember that detail clearly because it was the only time I ever saw his feet hesitate beside me. Then he spoke without looking at me. "If you ever leave me, you'll leave with nothing." He didn't mean money. He meant memory. He meant identity. He meant silence. But in that moment, I realized something he hadn't. I was already gone, piece by piece. All that remained was the part of me he couldn't erase. And I had just started listening to her again. The isolation wasn't sudden. It seeped in like fog, soft, quiet, nearly invisible until I was choking on it. I stopped recognizing myself in the mirror. My eyes were duller, my skin pale, even the way I walked changed. I moved like someone apologizing for existing. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection and wonder, who taught you to flinch like that? Kareem had a gift, a way of making his cruelty feel like logic. Like love. Like my own fault. If I dropped something, it wasn't clumsiness, it was a deliberate act to irritate him. If I cried, it wasn't pain, it was manipulation. If I raised a concern, it wasn't real, it was hysteria. You imagine too much, Layla. You love playing the victim. Why must you always find reasons to be unhappy? And I started believing him. The house became a gallery of silences. I walked on eggshells, never sure what would provoke him, a missed call, a forgotten light left on, a misplaced glass. But it wasn't the shouting that hurt the most. It was the moments in between, when he ignored me like I didn't exist. When his indifference suffocated more than his rage. Then came the vase. It was a wedding gift, pale blue, fragile porcelain from Italy. I had dusted it every morning. One day, I found it shattered across the hallway floor. Kareem stood nearby, face unreadable. "You knocked it over," he said quietly. I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. But his voice was calm, steady, like a man disappointed in a child. "I didn't," I whispered. He stared at me for a long time. "You did. You just don't remember." That night, I cried for hours. Not over the vase, but over the way his voice lingered in my head long after he left the room. "You just don't remember." I began to doubt my own memories. My own instincts. I needed a way to hold on to myself. So I began writing again, not stories, just moments. Feelings. Fragments of my mind I feared I'd lose. I used tissue paper from the guest bathroom, writing in the smallest handwriting possible. I folded each piece and hid them in the lining of my old coat. My secret archive of reality. my proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Then came the night of the envelope. Kareem had gone out to meet a business associate, dinner, wine, the usual late-night ritual. I waited 30 minutes after he left before sneaking into the office. The lock was newer than the rest of the house, modern, coded, cold. But I had watched him punch in the code a dozen times. 12:27, his late mother's birthday. The door clicked open. The room smelled like leather and paper. The shelves were lined with files, boxes, books. His desk was pristine, not a single thing out of place. But there, inside the top drawer, nestled under a folder marked Client Contracts, was a single black envelope. I didn't touch it right away. I just stared at it. It felt wrong. Sacred. Like something left behind in a church after midnight. I reached out. My fingers trembled for the first time in weeks. I pulled it from the drawer and held it under the light. No label. No name. Just sealed in thick black paper with a small wax mark on the edge, a wolf's head. I heard a car door slam outside. Too early. My heart slammed against my ribs. I turned toward the door, too late. Kareem stood there. No coat. No smile. His eyes locked on the envelope in my hand. And then, so fast I barely registered it, his palm struck my face. The sting was sharp, but it was the silence that followed that cut deeper. His breathing was steady. Mine wasn't. "You're lucky I haven't thrown you out yet," he said, voice low and even. He didn't snatch the envelope back. He simply held out his hand, waiting. I gave it to him. He slid it into his pocket, turned, and walked out. The door closed behind him with the softness of a whisper. I stood frozen in that office for what felt like hours. My cheek throbbed, but my mind was on that envelope. I didn't know what was inside it. But I knew, whatever it was, it didn't belong to him. Not truly. Because fear like that doesn't come from nothing. That envelope held something he couldn't control. And I had touched it. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts louder than the silence around me. Whatever was inside that black envelope, it wasn't done with me. It was an accident, or maybe fate, if you believe in that sort of thing. I was putting away Kareem's jacket after he dropped it carelessly across the dining chair. He never thanked me for these small acts of tidying, but they were my rituals. Quiet rebellions in the shape of folded collars and smooth sleeves. As I reached into the inside pocket, something thin brushed against my fingers. A photograph. Old, frayed at the edges, stained slightly yellow. I froze. It wasn't the kind of photo people carried anymore, printed on thick matte paper, the kind you don't just forget in your jacket. The woman in the photo looked to be in her late 20s. Dark eyes, messy curls tucked behind one ear. But it was her expression that grabbed me by the throat. She was crying. Her eyes wide, mouth half open like she was caught mid-sob. It wasn't posed. It was real. Raw. And terrifying. She looked like someone seconds before a scream. I stared at her for a long time. My breath grew shallow. The longer I looked, the more I saw something horrifyingly familiar in her gaze. She looked like me. I knew I couldn't ask Kareem about her. I knew better now. But I also couldn't let it go. The next day, I made an excuse to go to the market. Kareem approved without looking up from his tablet. "Be quick," he said. "Don't linger." I took the photograph with me, tucked deep inside the lining of my bag. The marketplace bustled with vendors shouting, children darting between carts, and the scent of spices thick in the air. I went to the oldest corner, where the shopkeepers had been there long enough to know stories the world had forgotten. At a stall selling second-hand books in faded frames, I found an old man rearranging stacks. I showed him the photograph. "Do you recognize her?" He squinted, adjusted his glasses. His fingers trembled as he took the photo. Then his face changed. Eyes narrowed. His voice dropped low. "Where did you get this?" She was in my husband's jacket," I admitted quietly. He glanced around, lowered his voice further. That's Yasmin. Kareem's first wife. My mouth went dry. But he told me he's never been married before. The old man laughed, not kindly. Of course he did. She vanished. Years ago. Just disappeared. No family, no funeral. Nothing. I stepped back. Vanished? They said she left. But I knew her. That girl wouldn't run. She was scared. You could see it in her eyes, just like this. He tapped the photo gently. The marketplace felt colder then, the noise more distant, like I'd been pulled underwater. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. Thank you, I whispered, barely managing to take the photo back with shaking hands. I didn't remember walking home. I barely remembered anything until I was sitting on the edge of our bed that night, the photograph hidden again, this time inside a hollowed-out book I kept beneath my mattress. Kareem was in the shower, humming something under his breath, an old tune he only sang when he thought I couldn't hear. I stared at the edge of the bed. What happened to Yasmin? How many others had sat where I sat, felt what I felt? The fear in her eyes clung to me now, like smoke I couldn't wash off. The longer I thought about it, the more I realized this house, his rules, his silences, they weren't built overnight. They were practiced. Refined. Perfected. Kareem wasn't just cruel. He was experienced. I reached into the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out the small recorder I had hidden weeks earlier, a tiny black device no bigger than my thumb. I hadn't used it yet. I hadn't dared. But Yasmin's eyes gave me courage. I crawled onto the floor, lifted the edge of the bed, and gently taped the recorder to the wooden frame beneath it, just beside where Kareem's feet would touch when he sat down. I hit the record button. The red light blinked once. If I couldn't open every drawer, I could at least record the creaks in the walls. Kareem came out of the bathroom a few minutes later, towel around his waist, steam curling around him like mist. He smiled at me. I smiled back. And underneath us, the recorder listened, quietly, patiently, like it had all the time in the world. The house had always breathed with secrets. Some rooms whispered. Others screamed. But the basement had always been mute, too clean, too quiet, like a mouth stitched shut. Kareem rarely went down there. He said it was just for storage. A few racks of wine bottles, old furniture draped in white sheets, sealed boxes with no labels. I'd only been allowed in once, shortly after we moved in. He locked the door behind us then, made sure I never asked again. But after I found Yasmin's photograph, after the shopkeeper's words echoed in my skull day and night, I began to see the house differently. I stopped treating it like a home. I studied it like a crime scene. That's how I noticed the shelf. The wine rack on the far wall of the basement, dusty but too perfectly arranged, too still. The symmetry of the bottles, the odd scratch pattern on the floor below, like something had been dragged back and forth, then covered up. One evening, when Kareem was out at a conference, I took the keys from his coat, silently, like muscle memory, and made my way down to the basement. The air was colder there, heavier. I moved slowly, running my fingers along the wall. Then I pressed against the wine rack. Nothing. I tried the other side. It shifted. I pressed harder. A soft click. The entire section of the wall groaned, then moved inward like a hidden door, a false wall swinging open just enough to reveal a narrow space beyond. Dust swirled up as I stepped inside. The room was small, maybe 6 by 10 feet. No windows. One bare bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering faintly when I pulled the chain. It wasn't empty. On the far side was a shelf lined with notebooks, old cassette tapes, and envelopes, most of them torn open, some water-damaged, but still legible. The papers were curled at the edges like they'd been touched too many times. The journals were bound in leather, the pages worn thin from revisiting. I picked up one, hands trembling. The handwriting was neat but frantic, a woman trying to capture her thoughts before they unraveled. It was Yasmin's. If you're reading this, the first page read, You survived him longer than I did. I sat down on the cold floor. Her words spilled out like blood from a reopened wound. She wrote about her early days with Kareem, the charm, the promises, the control. How quickly love turned into surveillance. How the rooms in the house began to shrink, how she would lose hours in a haze of confusion and fear. He takes your mind before he takes your body, one page read. By the time you realize you're not safe, you no longer trust yourself. Tears welled in my eyes. She described the same drawer. The black envelope. The silence. The threats. And something else, something worse. She wrote about a night she tried to leave. About a call she made to her sister that never went through. About documents she had collected, bank transfers, photos, medical records, and something she only called the tape. She hid them here. All of it. In this room, in case he ever erased her completely. If you find this, Yasmin wrote, finish what I couldn't. Don't let him make you a ghost. I read until the words blurred. Then I started packing. I found a canvas bag in the corner and filled it with the most intact materials, a stack of letters, 3 cassettes, 2 journals, and 1 photo album with names scrawled in the margins. I took photos of everything else, every damaged page, every name, every note, every date. When I emerged from the basement an hour later, it was like surfacing from water I hadn't known I was drowning in. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I left early, telling Kareem I had a headache and needed fresh air. I walked half a mile to the old post office by the railway. There was a P.O. box I'd paid for months ago under a false name, just in case. I never knew what I was preparing for. Now I did. I mailed the documents, 2 copies. 1 to the box. 1 to an address I'd memorized from one of Yasmin's letters, a woman named Zoya Malik. The letter said she was a former friend. Someone who knew Kareem once. Someone who asked too many questions. I didn't write a return address. I just wrote 1 sentence on a yellow sticky note. She didn't vanish. He made her disappear. I dropped the packages into the metal slot and listened for the hollow thud as they landed. It was the sound of secrets leaving their prison. The sound of a man's fear being born. Because Kareem's greatest terror wasn't the law. It was the mirror. The truth. And now, it was no longer only mine to carry. Something shifted after the basement. It wasn't sudden, like a crack in glass. It was slow, like heat rising in cold blood. Something inside me had caught fire, and though it didn't burn on the surface, I felt it, alive, pulsing, moving up my spine like a warning to stay very still and very aware. I stopped flinching. I started smiling. I cooked his favorite meals, asked him how his meetings went, kissed him goodnight without being asked. I did it all perfectly, a portrait of the wife he always claimed to deserve. But behind my eyes, I was carving something sharper than rage. And Kareem noticed. At first, he chalked it up to relief. I wasn't crying as much. I didn't argue. He thought he'd finally fixed me. But power makes men paranoid, and eventually, even silence becomes suspicious. One morning, I found him watching me over his coffee. His expression wasn't soft. It was tight, calculating. "You look smug," he said slowly, like tasting the word. I tilted my head. "Do I?" His eyes narrowed. "I'm just grateful," I added sweetly, and kissed his cheek before walking away. He didn't answer. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun shadows across the room. Kareem was beside me, asleep, or pretending to be. I could never tell anymore. The line between mask and face was so thin now. I turned on my side, staring at him. I knew how to hurt him. Not physically, I didn't have his strength. Not financially, he had cut me out of all his accounts. But I had something else. Words. His own. And now I needed them captured. I waited 3 more nights. 3 more perfect wife performances, timed and polished. I gave him no reason to doubt, no excuse to retreat. Then, on the fourth night, I made sure he saw me in that silk dress he liked, the one he said made me look like I belonged to someone important. "I missed you," I whispered as I walked past his study. He followed me to the bedroom. What followed was choreographed, soft words, gentle touches, the rhythm he expected. But under the bed, where his feet brushed against the wooden frame, the small voice recorder blinked quietly. Watching. Listening. In the silence after, when he lay on his back, half drunk on ego and pleasure, I curled against his chest. "Do you remember when you first hit me?" I asked softly, almost like a lover recalling a private joke. His breath caught. Just for a second. Then he exhaled. Smug. "You were screaming about a letter. I warned you not to push." I nodded against his shoulder. "You said you were protecting me," I murmured. "That I made you do it." He chuckled faintly. "And look how obedient you became." The words sat in the air like oil, heavy, slick, undeniable. He didn't see the recorder's red dot glowing faintly under the bed frame. I lifted my face, traced his jawline with one finger. "What are you most afraid of, Kareem?" I asked in the dark. He turned slightly, amused. "Losing control." "Of me?" He didn't speak. But I could feel his body stiffen. I leaned in closer, so close my lips touched his ear. "You think it's me you'll lose. But that's not your fear," I whispered. "Your fear is not losing me. It's what I'll leave with." He froze. A beat of silence. Then he laughed, trying to brush it off. "Don't be dramatic." But I had felt it, that tiny hesitation in his chest. That flicker. It was the sound of doubt. The crack beneath his confidence. I turned away and closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. Because I knew the fire was growing. And I was no longer afraid of it. I was becoming it. Kareem loved an audience. It wasn't enough for him to control things behind closed doors. He needed the world to believe that his life, his marriage, was enviable. Elegant. Perfect. So when he told me we were hosting a dinner for 4 of his colleagues and their wives, I knew exactly what he was doing. A performance. I was to be the well-kept wife, graceful, obedient, soft-spoken. A background decoration in his kingdom. Not too loud, not too quiet. Not too anything. Just polished. But things had changed. I smiled and nodded. I wore the blue dress he liked, the one he said made me look expensive. I spent the whole afternoon preparing the food, arranging flowers, ironing napkins until they folded like museum pieces. But I wasn't poisoning the meal. I was poisoning the illusion. The guests arrived at 7 sharp. Laughter, handshakes, the smell of wine and cologne filling the space. Kareem greeted everyone with charms so well rehearsed, even I nearly believed it. He placed a possessive hand on my back. "Gentlemen, this is my wife, Layla. She keeps the place running while I work like a mule." Everyone chuckled. I laughed too, tilting my head like I'd been trained to do. But inside, something tightened. We sat. We ate. Conversation flowed easily, stocks, politics, vacation homes. The wives sipped their wine and compared charities. Kareem made jokes. Complimented me twice in front of them. One of the guests, a younger associate named Rafiq, smiled at me during dessert. "You must get bored in this big house," he said. Kareem's jaw twitched. I smiled at Rafiq. "I used to be a painter," I said softly. "Oh? Do you still paint?" Kareem cut in, laughing. "She dabbles now and then. But I prefer her hands in the kitchen." Polite laughter. I turned to Rafiq. Held his gaze a second longer than necessary. I stopped painting because I was told no one would want the truth on a canvas. The room quieted for a moment. Kareem reached for his wine, but his knuckles were white around the glass stem. One of the wives raised her eyebrows. "The truth?" she asked, curious. I leaned in, smiling as I poured more wine. Some men prefer their women silent. It's easier to pretend they're happy that way. Silence. A long, slow, uncomfortable silence. Kareem cleared his throat. Layla, don't be dramatic. I set the wine bottle down with a soft thud. Am I being dramatic? I turned to the guests, my smile still fixed. Or just, honest. Kareem's hand gripped the edge of the table. His colleagues looked between us, unsure whether to laugh or intervene. Then it happened. He stood abruptly. Enough, he said, loud, firm. Layla, you're embarrassing yourself. I think I'm doing fine, I replied calmly. He moved around the table toward me. Layla, he growled under his breath, low enough only I could hear. Sit down and shut your mouth. Everyone saw it, the way he towered over me. The way his voice dropped like a blade. For a heartbeat, the room stopped breathing. I stood slowly, matching his height, though barely at his shoulder. If I'm silent, I'm obedient. If I speak, I'm dramatic. There's no version of me you love. Only the one you control. One of the wives rose from her chair. The others exchanged glances. One of the men whispered something to Rafiq, who watched Kareem now with narrowed eyes. It had happened. The mask slipped. And he knew it. He turned, nodded stiffly to his guests. Thank you all for coming. I think it's best we end the night here. They didn't argue. The room emptied awkwardly. Muted goodbyes. Downcast glances. Doors closing one by one. When the last car pulled away, he slammed the front door shut so hard the glass rattled. He turned to me, face flushed with rage. You just ruined everything. No, I said. I revealed it. He took a step forward, trembling with fury. You'll leave with nothing. I met his gaze, calm and unmoving. We'll see. The words hung in the air like smoke. Then I turned and walked past him, not to retreat, but to remind him that I didn't fear his volume anymore. Because silence is only power when it belongs to the abuser. And mine had just turned into a weapon. I packed in silence. There was no screaming this time, no thrown objects or slammed doors. Kareem had made himself clear. Leave. And take nothing. His voice still echoed in my skull, low and venomous. But it no longer scared me. This time, I wasn't afraid. I moved room to room like a ghost, folding nothing, organizing nothing. I didn't take the designer clothes he bought to parade me around his parties. I didn't take the earrings he gave me after the first time he hit me, a bribe disguised as an apology. I didn't touch the rings, the purses, the shoes. None of it mattered. None of it was mine. But in the bedroom, I paused by the drawer. The one he always kept locked. The one that, months ago, I had finally opened. What lay inside had changed everything. Now, it was time to take it. I opened the drawer slowly, without hesitation. The black envelope waited there, just as I'd left it, thick, ominous, sealed tightly. It felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of the years it had been hidden. I slipped it into the inside pocket of my coat. I knew what it contained, I had studied it in secret for weeks. Inside were pages Kareem never meant anyone to see. Bank statements, money moved quietly across accounts, some tied to Yasmin's name long after she was declared missing. Copies of medical records, psychiatric evaluations forged in her name, declaring her unstable. And worst of all, a death certificate. Not hers, someone else's. A man connected to her, a name she had written in her journal more than once. It had been filed quietly, with no autopsy. The envelope also held several letters, real, shaky, signed in Yasmin's handwriting. Letters begging for help. Letters never sent. Letters that accused Kareem of things no husband should ever be accused of. It was more than enough. I went to the living room and opened the secret compartment in the base of a ceramic vase, one Kareem never noticed I'd tampered with. I retrieved the flash drive. I'd backed up everything. Photographs, letters, audio recordings, including the night he casually confessed to hitting me, and worse. The recorder under the bed had done its job. I walked out the front door with no suitcase. Just the flash drive. And the envelope. The street was empty, the air thick with the kind of stillness that only happens before something breaks. I walked 6 blocks to a mailbox in front of the abandoned post office. It was always there, even though the building had long been shut down. But the box still worked. Still took in secrets. I mailed 3 manila envelopes. Each with carefully organized evidence. One to the local police chief, anonymous, with a typed note attached. Please reopen the file on Yasmin Kadir. She didn't run. He buried her in silence. One to a journalist who had covered a cold case podcast. She had a reputation for chasing stories men wanted buried. And one to a man named Harun Kadir, Yasmin's brother. I had found his name in the letters and searched quietly through public records. He lived in Rawalpindi now. No public social media. A man who had likely mourned in silence for years. I didn't write my name. I didn't need to. I left the post office and walked without turning back. The house behind me, that mausoleum of control and quiet cruelty, no longer owned a piece of me. I had taken what mattered. Not revenge. Not justice. But the one thing Kareem had feared all along. The truth. Not the kind that sat in drawers, silent and buried, waiting. But the kind that breathes. That walks. That leaks. The kind that spreads. The flash drive in my pocket was warm against my thigh. I kept my hand on it the whole walk home, not out of fear, but protection. It carried voices of women who were silenced. Memories Kareem tried to erase. Proof he never thought anyone would find. He wanted me to leave with nothing. But I was leaving with everything he couldn't control. And it was already too late for him. The news came exactly 1 week later. Kareem was arrested in the early hours of the morning. The neighbors said unmarked cars pulled into the driveway just after 5 a.m., and within 20 minutes, he was in handcuffs, face pale, hair uncombed, the illusion of power finally shattered. The headlines were relentless. Entrepreneur tied to missing woman case arrested. New evidence sparks investigation into Yasmin Kadir's disappearance. Hidden letters, recordings, and financial documents surface. His face was everywhere, no longer the polished image from magazine covers and charity galas, but a man exposed under harsh light. And his empire? It collapsed overnight. Business partners released statements. We were unaware. We condemn. We have severed all ties. Investors fled. Sponsorships evaporated. A university quietly took his name off the donor's wall. And people talked, finally, openly. Employees came forward. Women who had dated him in the past. Neighbors who had noticed bruises, or silences, or moments that hadn't made sense until now. The walls were speaking. Layla didn't say a word. She ignored the reporters who waited outside her sister's apartment. She deleted interview requests from journalists and turned down offers for books and documentaries. She had already said everything that needed saying, with evidence, with courage, with quiet precision. Now, she just wanted peace. A few days later, on a gray afternoon, she boarded a bus to the outskirts of the city. In her coat pocket was a small folded note. In her hand, a single white flower. The cemetery was quiet. Yasmin's grave was near the back, a modest stone, barely weathered, with her name etched softly into it. Layla stood there a long time, fingers wrapped around the note, heart beating gently in her chest. There was no speech. No tears. Just a silence filled with meaning. She bent down, placed the flower against the stone, and tucked the note beneath it. It read. He never silenced you. You were my map. Then she stood, exhaled, and turned toward the road, the wind brushing past her like a whisper. The past wasn't gone. But it was no longer in control. The sign above the door was hand-painted, the letters uneven but deliberate. The the studio of broken things. It sat tucked between two gray buildings on a quiet street in the older part of the city. There was no grand opening, no ribbon-cutting ceremony. Just a simple door, always left slightly ajar, as if welcoming those afraid to knock. Inside, the scent of paint mingled with the soft hum of music and whispered voices. The walls were a collage, not pristine white, but covered in brush strokes, handprints, and quotes scribbled in charcoal. A chaos of color and story. And at the center of it all was Layla. Her hair was longer now, always tied loosely at the nape of her neck. She wore paint-smeared overalls and soft eyes. Most days, she walked barefoot through the studio, carrying cups of tea or fresh canvases, listening more than she spoke. It wasn't just an art studio. It was a sanctuary. Each week, women came, not always with words, but with weight. With invisible wounds and stories still lodged in their throats. Some were referred by counselors. Others just showed up, their hands shaking, unsure of why they had come at all. There were no intake forms. No questions. Only one rule: create. Don't explain. There were tables with broken mirrors, torn books, old photographs, ceramic shards, things most would throw away. Here, they were tools. Materials. Meaning waiting to be reshaped. Layla painted too, sometimes. Not the soft landscapes she once dreamed of, but raw things, bruised torsos with wings growing from their backs, silhouettes with stitched mouths and flame-colored eyes, hands holding broken glass that somehow glowed. And slowly, others began to paint like that too. They wrote on walls. They screamed into clay. They stitched names into torn fabric, poured ink over old wedding photos, painted over their fears until only color remained. It was healing, but it wasn't gentle. One rainy afternoon, the bell over the door chimed softly. Layla looked up from the canvas she was priming. A girl stood at the entrance. 17, maybe 18. Thin. Shoulders hunched. A hoodie pulled low over her face. She didn't speak. Didn't move. Just stood there, as if expecting to be told to leave. Layla walked over slowly, hands still stained with ochre and blue. "Hi," she said gently. "You're here. That's enough for today." The girl's lip was swollen. One eye bruised. But her grip on the doorframe was tight, like it was the only thing anchoring her. Layla reached to the side and picked up a paintbrush, thick, sturdy, wrapped in worn red tape. She held it out. "Take one thing back," she said softly. "That's how it begins." The girl looked at the brush for a long time, her eyes darting between Layla's face and the paint-splattered floor. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. No words. Just breath. And that was enough. Layla stepped aside, letting her walk in. Somewhere, one of the other women had started humming. Soft, broken at first, but growing steadier. The storm outside rolled on. But inside the studio, another storm had ended. Or maybe, it had just begun again, this time, in color.